Hello, students, and welcome to my class. Today, we are doing Jane Eyre. As I've already given you the introduction of Victorian age and the novelist Charlotte Bronte. Today, I'll give you a synopsis of this novel, a very short story, or just a synopsis of this novel, a quick work I'll do. That is, Charlotte Bronte actually adopted the form of autobiography, not merely because Jane Eyre and all her characters, they stood for herself, but from her pressing desire to speak out on many things which novelists had hitherto left in discreet silence. So she just wanted to say that a woman with a plain face, with nothing but sincerity of feeling and strong character to recommend her, was an innovation among the heroines. That is, normally heroines are very beautiful, smart, slim, but here her heroine is very plain-faced. No less new was the frank avowal of a woman's passion, her revolt against social conventions, narrow religious dogmas, and other obstacles to a fuller life. So, all her novels expound the theme of self realization, and this is the idea that spiritualizes and ennobles her conception of love. So, now let's see the synopsis of the novel. So, here is a synopsis of the novel. Now, this novel is about Jane, and Jane is an orphan girl living at Gateshead Hall. So, Jane Eyre, an orphan girl about 10 years old, is living at Gateshead Hall as a dependent of the Reed family. Her uncle, Mr. John Reed, had died and had left Jane Eyre to the care of his wife, Mrs. Sarah Reed, who, however, proves to be a heartless woman and who treats Jane most shabbily and almost cruelly. So, in order to get rid of the girl, Mrs. Reed sends Jane to a charity school called Lowood School, where the girl begins to live as a charity student. Now, charity students are that they get educated on the basis of charity. Charity का मतलब होता है जैसे कि किसी को जैसे अपन दान देते हैं, कुछ चीज़ दान के ऊपर आश्रित जो ये जो स्टूडेंट्स होते हैं उनकी पढ़ाई होती है. So means they don't pay for their own food and for their own education. As a student, and then as a teacher at Lowood School. Jane Eyre's experiences at Lowood School are almost as painful as were those at Gateshead Hall, though here she finds some compensations in the kindness of the school superintendent, Miss Temple, and in the comfort of a friendship with a girl called Helen Burns. Jane spent 6 years at this school as a student and later 2 years at the same school as a teacher. So, the third place where she goes is she's in love with Mr. Rochester, the owner of the Thornfield Hall. Feeling a desire for a change in the pattern and routine of her life, Jane Eyre manages to get an appointment as a governess to a French girl, Adele, living in a country mansion called Thornfield Hall. Adele is the illegitimate daughter of a French opera dancer who had at one time been the mistress of Mr. Rochester, the owner of Thornfield Hall. Mr. Rochester had undertaken to bring up Adele as his ward, though the girl was in no way related to him, directly or indirectly. During her stay at Thornfield Hall, Jane Eyre, who is at this time nearing 20, falls in love with Mr. Rochester, who is nearing 40. Mr. Rochester is almost double her age, and she falls in love with him. Mr. Rochester does not stay at Thornfield Hall on regular basis, and he visits Thornfield Hall occasionally and then goes away, thus giving rise to a feeling of mystery in the minds of the servants at the house and later in the minds of Jane Eyre too. Mr. Rochester is by no means a handsome man, and Jane Eyre herself is by no means a beautiful girl. That is, Mr. Rochester is also a normal person, and Jane Eyre is also a normal girl, not a very beautiful one. Jane falls in love with Mr. Rochester but keeps her love to herself. But in the meantime, Mr. Rochester too falls in love with Jane. Now, दोनों एक दूसरे में they fall in love with each other. Thus, in an odd kind of love affair, because there is a difference of 20 years between the ages of the two persons involved in it. Now, there's a difference of 20 years. So, Mr. Rochester, already a married man. As the story unfolds, we come to know a complicating circumstance is the fact that Mr. Rochester is already a married man with his wife Bertha living in the same house. We do not come to know about it, nor does Jane comes to know, namely Thornfield Hall. Now, Bertha is a mad woman whom Mr. Rochester had married without knowing anything about Bertha's insanity. However, after coming to know of Bertha's lunacy, he had not discarded her, but had lodged her in a room on top story of Thornfield Hall, and put her under the care and charge of a maid servant by the name Grace Poole. Now, Grace Poole used to look after Bertha, and Bertha used to be locked up in the house on the top story. Now, when the ceremony of the marriage takes place, it is interrupted and then given up. Without telling Jane anything about his previous marriage, Mr. Rochester now offers to marry Jane, and she, in love with him as she is, agrees to this proposal, though not without some vague misgivings. But she has some sort of doubts, but still she agrees to marry him. Just when the marriage ceremony is being performed at the local church, Bertha's brother, one Richard Mason, appears on the scene with a solicitor, Mr. Briggs of London, and interrupts the ceremony. That is, they stop the ceremony of marriage. The solicitor is just a vakil hota hai, advocate. He points out to the priest and the small gathering that Mr. Rochester is already a married man with his wife living in the same house in which he himself lives. And now Jane is shocked by this disclosure, and soon afterwards she quits Thornfield Hall in spite of Mr. Rochester's entreaties and pleas not to forsake him. That Rochester tells her to forgive him and not to abandon him, but still she leaves him. Now the next situation in Jane's life is that Jane's arrival at the residence of Mr. John Rivers. Jane Eyre is now feeling more miserable than ever before. Cheated of her hopes, she roams about aimlessly with no money at all in her pocket. Tired and hungry, she looks for food to sustain herself. But nobody offers her either food or shelter or even sympathy till, physically exhausted and famished means hungry, she arrives at the Moor House, which is the residence of St. John Rivers, a clergyman and a missionary, and his two sisters, Dinah and Mary. Here she receives food, shelter, and sympathy too, and she begins to live here at the suggestion of St. John Rivers and his sisters, and later becomes a teacher at the school in the village of Morton, where St. John Rivers is the parish priest. So, St. John Rivers' proposal of marriage is declined by Jane Eyre. St. John Rivers wants to marry Jane Eyre and take her to India with him as his wife to help him in his missionary work there. But Jane Eyre, who is unable to forget Mr. Rochester, politely but firmly declines the matrimonial proposal of Mr. St. John Rivers. Then they have two surprises for Jane Eyre. Then two surprising developments take place. Jane Eyre discovers, to her own surprise and to the surprise also of the River family, that St. John, Diana, and Mary, all these brothers and sisters, are her cousins. And the second development is the news that Jane Eyre's uncle had died in the West Indies and has left his entire wealth, amounting to £20,000, to Jane Eyre. And Jane Eyre divides the whole amount of £20,000 into 4 equal parts, giving each of her 3 cousins of the Rivers family an amount of £5,000 and keeping an equal amount and no more for herself. Actually, this shows that how magnanimous she is. The last is the fulfillment of Jane's passionate love for Mr. Rochester. Then an even more surprising development takes place, and Jane Eyre finds that Thornfield Hall has been burned down by a fire, and that Mr. Rochester, who had been blinded while trying vainly to rescue his mad wife from being burnt alive, is now living alone as a blind man and almost as a cripple at a small cottage in the village of Ferndean. That is, Mr. Rochester, he's become blind, andhe ho gaya tha wo, or he had become crippled. That is, he had become incapacitated. So, as his wife, Jane travels to that place to meet Mr. Rochester and gets married to him because of her love for him, has in no way been diminished by his helpless condition. And as his wife, Jane experiences the bliss which had always eluded her before. After a time, Mr. Rochester largely recovers his eyesight, and the couple then embark upon a blissful conjugal life. Thus does the passionate love of Jane Eyre for a man 20 years older than herself achieve its fulfillment. So, this is a brief story. I mean, the story in brief. It's a huge novel, but this is just a synopsis, or it's just a glimpse of the story which you're going to read in the novel. So this is the outline, you can say. This is the outline of the story. And in the coming sessions, we will be doing the story in detail, and we will also be doing characterization and the plot and all these things. This is all for today. I hope you like the story, and we will take further sessions to work upon this story in detail. Thank you for listening.